"Don't touch that gate," she said. "You have no idea what you're about to expose." The warning came 3 seconds before my angle grinder bit through the first hinge. Sparks sprayed across the wet gravel, bright orange against the gray morning, and the smell of scorched steel mixed with pine sap and last night's rain. Behind me, Vanessa Whitmore stood beside her white Lexus with both hands locked around her phone. She wasn't angry. That was what caught my attention. She looked scared. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 43, a former excavation contractor, and 6 months earlier I'd inherited 38 acres of wooded Tennessee hillside from my Uncle Ray. The property wasn't fancy. An old farmhouse, 2 equipment sheds, a creek running along the eastern boundary, and 1 narrow gravel road disappearing through the trees toward the back 12 acres. Uncle Ray had maintained that road for 30 years. I remembered riding beside him in his battered Ford when I was 12, listening to gravel pop beneath the tires while he pointed at faded survey posts along the shoulder. "Land doesn't argue with you, Danny," he'd told me. "People do. That's why you keep the paperwork." I didn't understand how important that sentence was until Vanessa showed up. She was president of Cedar Ridge Estates, the expensive subdivision bordering my southern property line. Perfect blonde hair, cream-colored jacket, pearl earrings, the kind of smile that appeared before the threat did. 3 weeks after I moved in, she drove onto my property in a golf cart and informed me that the gravel road behind my barn was a community emergency access corridor. There was only one problem. My deed said otherwise. Parcel 14B, private property. No recorded vehicular easement. No HOA rights. Nothing. Yet half a mile down that road stood a 12-foot black steel gate stamped Cedar Ridge HOA, authorized access only. Vanessa had installed it directly between 2 survey markers on my land. When I asked for the authorization, she handed me a photocopied map with no county seal and told me not to create unnecessary problems. That phrase stayed with me. So did the gate. I spent 2 weeks checking records before touching anything. County plats, title history, utility easements, old aerial photographs. Every document said the same thing. The road belonged to me. I sent Cedar Ridge certified notice giving them 10 days to remove their gate. Vanessa responded with a $2,500 infrastructure interference penalty. I wasn't even a member of her HOA. That's when I stopped arguing. On Saturday morning, I rolled my compressor and tools down the gravel road. The gate chain rattled in the wind as I set the grinder against the hinge. Vanessa arrived before I finished the first cut. Too fast. Almost like she'd been watching that road. "You're destroying HOA property," she snapped. "I'm removing abandoned hardware from mine." Her thumb moved across her phone. "I'm calling the police." "Please do." That answer wiped the smile off her face. 20 minutes later, a county cruiser crawled through the trees. Deputy Harris stepped out, boots sinking slightly into the damp shoulder. Vanessa rushed toward him before his door closed. "Trespassing. Vandalism. Threats." She poured the words out so quickly they almost tripped over each other. Harris listened, then looked at my deed, the certified notice, and the survey pins I'd marked with fluorescent tape. His expression changed. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "this gate appears to be on Mr. Mercer's parcel." Silence. Even the birds seemed to disappear. I cut the second hinge. The gate dropped with a metallic boom that rolled through the trees. And that's when we finally saw what had been hidden behind it. Fresh tire tracks. Heavy ones. Dozens of them. They disappeared around the bend toward a part of my property I hadn't reached since inheriting it. Deputy Harris stared down the road. Vanessa went completely pale. Then the wind shifted. A strange chemical smell drifted through the pines. Harris looked at me. I looked at Vanessa. She whispered, "You need to put that gate back." That was the moment I realized the HOA hadn't built it to keep me out of their neighborhood. They'd built it to keep me from discovering what they'd been doing on my land. What would you do? Follow the tracks or wait for backup? The chemical smell got stronger after the gate came down. Sharp. Synthetic. Something between hot plastic and industrial cleaner. Completely wrong for 38 acres of wet Tennessee pine. Deputy Harris lifted one hand before I could start walking. "Nobody goes down there yet." Vanessa answered too quickly. "Exactly. It could be dangerous." Harris turned toward her. I was talking to him. Her mouth closed. I crouched beside the tire tracks instead. Years running excavation crews taught me how to read disturbed ground almost as easily as paperwork. These weren't pickup tracks. Dual rear wheels. Heavy loads. Repeated traffic. The mud had been compressed into 2 deep channels, and crushed limestone had recently been spread through the worst sections. Somebody had been maintaining my road. Harris photographed everything while I followed the tracks with my eyes toward the bend. Vanessa stayed beside her Lexus, tapping furiously at her phone. "Who are you texting?" Harris asked. "Our HOA attorney." "Then you won't mind putting the phone away until we understand what's happening." Her fingers stopped. That tiny pause told me more than her answer. Harris called for another deputy, and 25 minutes later we moved past the fallen gate together. Every step felt wrong. The gravel changed about 100 yards in. Uncle Ray's old gray stone disappeared beneath fresh, crushed aggregate. Then I noticed orange survey ribbon tied around several trees. Not mine. Beyond them, branches had been cut high enough for commercial trucks to pass. Vanessa followed 30 feet behind us, complaining about liability, private HOA operations, and environmental maintenance. She kept producing explanations nobody had requested. That's when I remembered something Uncle Ray used to say whenever a subcontractor talked too much after making a mistake. Honest work usually explains itself. We rounded the bend. I stopped. So did Harris. The back 12 acres were supposed to be woods. Instead, maybe 2 acres had been cleared behind an artificial wall of pine branches and green privacy mesh. 3 large metal containers sat on compacted gravel. Beside them were stacked blue industrial drums, broken concrete, roofing material, landscaping debris, and black plastic-wrapped pallets. A yellow skid steer rested near a freshly disturbed mound of earth. My earth. For several seconds, all I heard was the soft ticking of Harris's cruiser cooling somewhere behind us and water dripping from the trees. "What the hell is this?" I asked. Vanessa finally lost that polished HOA voice. "It's temporary storage." Harris looked at her. "For what?" "Community maintenance materials." I pointed toward the disturbed soil. "Why are your community maintenance materials buried on my property?" Her eyes flicked toward the mound. There it was. Half a second. Fear. Harris saw it too. He stepped closer but didn't touch anything. A faded contractor logo was visible on one container. Cedar Ridge Property Services. Below it, someone had painted over an identification number, but the old lettering still showed through. Harris photographed it. Then we found the paperwork. A clear plastic job sleeve had been wedged beneath a rock beside the skid steer. Rainwater clouded the cover, but the sheet inside was readable. Cedar Ridge Estates. Disposal Site B. Authorized by V. Whitmore. My stomach went cold. Site B. Not temporary storage. Not an accident. A designated site. How long? I asked. Vanessa stared at the paper without answering. Harris's radio crackled. The second deputy had arrived at the gate. Harris told him to secure the entrance and request county environmental enforcement. That was when Vanessa stepped toward me. "Daniel, we can resolve this privately." Her voice had changed completely. No threats. No penalties. No community standards. Just desperation wrapped in expensive perfume. "You send me a $2,500 fine for touching your gate," I said, "while you're using my land as a dumping site? You don't understand the arrangement your uncle had with us." That stopped me. "My uncle." She realized the mistake immediately. Harris did too. "What arrangement?" he asked. Vanessa said nothing. Then a low electronic chirp came from behind the nearest container. Once. Twice. Harris walked around it carefully. Mounted to a pine tree was a small trail camera pointed directly at the road. Not toward the dump. Toward the gate. Toward anyone approaching from my property. I stared at Vanessa. She hadn't just blocked the road. She'd been monitoring it. Harris removed nothing. He simply photographed the camera and called it in. I looked back at the steel gate lying hundreds of yards behind us and finally understood why Vanessa had arrived before I'd finished cutting the first hinge. She hadn't guessed I was there. She had watched me arrive. And if she'd been watching that road for months, there was only one question that mattered now. What exactly had she been so afraid my uncle, or I, would see? The trail camera wasn't the worst thing we found that morning. 20 minutes later, County Environmental Officer Rachel Monroe arrived in a mud-splattered pickup, carrying a field case and wearing the expression of someone who had already learned not to trust anything described as temporary storage. She stopped beside the blue drums and sniffed the air once. "Nobody touches these." Vanessa folded her arms. "They're landscaping chemicals. Cedar Ridge maintains extensive common areas." Rachel ignored her and photographed every label she could reach without moving anything. Several had been scraped clean. One still carried a faded warning diamond. Another had dark residue dried around its cap. The sweet chemical odor clung to the back of my throat. I looked toward the creek less than 200 yards downhill and felt my jaw tighten. That creek crossed my property before feeding Miller Branch, where families downstream kept cattle and pulled irrigation water. Suddenly, this wasn't just somebody dumping broken shingles behind my trees. Rachel followed the slope with her eyes. "Where's the drainage?" I pointed east. "Creek." Vanessa immediately said, "There has never been contamination." Rachel turned slowly. "I didn't say there was." Vanessa's face tightened. "Another mistake." By noon, yellow evidence tape stretched across the cleared area. Harris told me the property was still mine, but until the county documented the site, I needed to leave everything exactly as we'd found it. Fine by me. I wasn't interested in revenge with a shovel. I wanted records. Back at the farmhouse, I pulled Uncle Ray's filing cabinet away from the wall. It smelled like dust, machine oil, and old tobacco, even though he'd quit smoking 20 years earlier. Ray saved everything. Tax receipts, equipment manuals, handwritten fence measurements, even fuel tickets from tractors he no longer owned. If Vanessa had really made some arrangement with him, there would be paper. 3 hours later, I found an envelope marked Cedar Ridge Road. Inside were 6 letters. The first was dated 4 years earlier. Vanessa had asked Ray for permission to use the back road for temporary landscape vehicle access during construction of a new subdivision entrance. Ray's answer consisted of one sentence typed beneath her request. Permission denied. The second letter offered him $500 a month. Denied. The third called the road an emergency access route. Ray had attached a copy of the county plat and circled the absence of any easement in red ink. Then came the letter that changed everything. It wasn't from Vanessa. It was from a hauling contractor. "Dear Mr. Mercer, we apologize for entering Parcel 14B under instructions provided by Cedar Ridge Estates. Operations have ceased pending clarification of ownership authorization." Attached was a delivery log, truck numbers, dates, load counts, 27 trips in 6 weeks. I could hear Uncle Ray's voice again. People argue. Paper doesn't. At the bottom of the envelope was a photograph. Ray standing beside the same black steel gate, holding that day's newspaper. On the back he'd written, "Installed without permission. County notified. September 14th. My phone rang before I could process it. "Harris. Daniel, I need to ask you something. Did your uncle ever report illegal dumping?" I stared at the photograph. "Looks like he tried." Silence on the line. Then Harris said, "We found another camera." "Where?" "Facing the county road. Different angle. Whoever installed these wanted warning before anyone reached the site." I looked through the kitchen window toward the tree line. The afternoon sun had turned the wet gravel silver. For the first time, the farmhouse didn't feel isolated. It felt watched. "There's more," Harris said. "Environmental enforcement checked the contractor name from that container. Cedar Ridge Property Services dissolved 18 months ago. Then who's been bringing material in? That's what we're trying to determine." A vehicle slowed outside. White Lexus. Vanessa didn't enter the driveway. She stopped at the mailbox, stared directly toward my kitchen, then drove away. 5 minutes later, I found a fresh envelope inside. No stamp. No return address. Just my name. Inside was a copy of Uncle Ray's signature beneath a document titled Property Access Agreement. For half a second, my stomach dropped. Then I noticed the date. The agreement claimed Ray signed it 11 months after the letter denying access. There was just one problem. I had signed hospital paperwork beside my uncle that exact week after a stroke left his right hand partially paralyzed. The signature on Vanessa's agreement was smooth, strong, almost perfect. Too perfect. I laid Ray's denial letter beside it. Same name. Completely different hand. That's when this stopped looking like an HOA that had crossed a property line. Someone had created paperwork to make the crossing look legal. And Vanessa had just delivered the evidence to my mailbox herself. The envelope smelled faintly of Vanessa's perfume. That was the first thing I noticed after the anger wore off. Citrus, powder, something expensive. The same scent that had hung in the air when she stood beside that steel gate telling me I was interfering with HOA property. I slipped the forged agreement into a clear document sleeve and called Deputy Harris. "Don't write on it," he said. "Don't fold it again. And don't confront her." Wasn't planning to. That wasn't entirely true. 20 minutes earlier, I'd wanted to march straight into Cedar Ridge's clubhouse and put the document under Vanessa's manicured fingers. But Uncle Ray had taught me something else besides keeping paperwork. Never interrupt somebody while they're building the case against themselves. The next morning, Harris met me at the county records office. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while a clerk pulled every document Cedar Ridge had filed involving Parcel 14B. There weren't many. That was the problem. No easement, no transfer, no recorded access agreement. Nothing showing Ray had ever surrendered control of that road. Then the clerk found a permit application from 18 months earlier. Cedar Ridge had requested approval for a temporary community landscape staging area. The listed location wasn't my parcel. It was an HOA-owned maintenance lot almost 2 miles away. Harris tapped the address with his pen. So why is there equipment on your land? Because nobody looking at this permit would know where they actually put it. He gave me that quiet cop look that meant I'd reached the same conclusion he had. Somebody hadn't merely trespassed. Somebody had created 2 realities, one on paper for the county and another behind that gate. By afternoon, things escalated. Rachel called from the environmental site. Preliminary field screening had detected petroleum-related residue in soil near the drums. Nothing conclusive yet, she warned me. Samples were going to a lab. But until results came back, the county wanted the disturbed area secured. When I drove home, 2 Cedar Ridge board members were waiting beside my mailbox. Neither was Vanessa. One introduced himself as Thomas Bell, the HOA treasurer. The other, Ellen Price, had served on the board for 6 years. They looked less like suburban dictators and more like people who hadn't slept. Thomas held a folder against his chest. Vanessa told us you threatened to destroy HOA infrastructure. I pointed toward the woods. Did she tell you where that infrastructure was? Silence. Ellen finally asked, can we see the deed? I showed them copies. Then raised denial letters. Then the hauling contractor's apology. I saved the forged agreement for last. Thomas stared at the signature for a long time. I've seen this before. My skin went cold. Where? Board packet. Maybe last year. Vanessa said your uncle granted permanent access. Was it ever voted on? Ellen shook her head. She told us legal had already cleared it. There it was again. Authority without verification. A sentence repeated often enough that everyone stopped asking for proof. Thomas opened his folder. Inside were payment summaries. Cedar Ridge had been spending thousands every month on off-site landscape disposal through a vendor called GreenLine Environmental Management. Same billing amount. Same approval initials. VW. Where's GreenLine located? I asked. Thomas swallowed. That's why we're here. I checked this morning. The mailing address is a UPS box. Gravel crackled behind us. A white Lexus turned into my driveway. Vanessa stepped out before the engine stopped. Her heels struck the gravel like little hammer blows. You two have no authority to share confidential association records. Thomas stiffened. Ellen didn't move. Vanessa looked at me. Daniel, you're creating consequences you don't understand. I almost laughed. Instead, I held up Ray's forged agreement inside its plastic sleeve. For the first time since I'd met her, Vanessa had nothing ready to say. Her eyes dropped to the signature, then to Harris's cruiser turning onto the road behind her. The color drained from her face. Harris parked, stepped out, and closed his door with a soft metallic click. Ms. Whitmore, he said, I'd like to speak with you about this document. Vanessa recovered just enough to smile. Certainly. Our attorney prepared everything. Harris nodded. Good. Then identifying who created it should be easy. Her smile disappeared. The air went still. Pine needles whispered overhead. Somewhere beyond the barn, water moved through the creek that now sat downhill from barrels nobody could explain. Vanessa glanced toward her Lexus as if measuring the distance. Harris noticed. So did I? And that's when I understood something important. The gate wasn't her secret anymore. The forged signature wasn't either. Her own board had started opening files. Once that happened, she wasn't fighting me. She was fighting records, witnesses, environmental samples, and people who finally realized they'd been signing checks without knowing where the money went. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just stepped aside and let the paperwork speak. Vanessa didn't get arrested that afternoon. That surprised Thomas more than it surprised me. Harris asked questions, photographed the forged agreement, documented how it reached my mailbox, and told Vanessa not to contact me except through counsel. She smiled like she'd won something. So we're finished here? She asked. Harris closed his notebook. I didn't say that. The smile disappeared. 2 days later, Cedar Ridge struck back. I woke to the hiss of rain against my bedroom window and 3 certified envelopes waiting at the post office. One threatened civil action for destruction of HOA property. Another demanded $18,700 for replacement of the gate and security infrastructure. The third accused me of obstructing emergency access. I wasn't a Cedar Ridge homeowner, yet somehow Vanessa had managed to manufacture 20 pages of violations against a man her association had no authority over. I spread them across Uncle Ray's kitchen table. Fresh printer ink, heavy cream paper, legal language designed to make ordinary people panic. Instead, I made coffee. Then I started a binder. Deed, survey, photographs, certified notices, raised denial letters, contractor apology, forged access agreement, environmental case number. Every document went behind a labeled divider. Years of excavation work had taught me that when a trench starts collapsing, you don't climb inside and argue with the dirt. You shore up your position. By Friday, Thomas called. His voice was low. Vanessa scheduled an emergency board meeting tonight. About me? About controlling the narrative. That phrase almost made me smile. I attended because Thomas and Ellen requested my presence. Cedar Ridge's clubhouse smelled like lemon cleaner and expensive coffee. Nearly 60 homeowners packed the room. Vanessa sat at the front beneath a polished wooden sign reading Community Integrity Home. The irony could have powered the building. She opened with photographs of my grinder cutting the gate. Not the dumping site. Not the drums. Not raised letters. Just sparks flying from steel. This individual, she announced, pointing toward me, has launched an aggressive campaign against our community. Murmurs rolled through the room. I stayed seated. Vanessa wanted anger. Anger would make me look exactly like the man she described. Then Thomas stood. Show them the parcel map. Silence. Vanessa's jaw tightened. That's unrelated to tonight's security discussion. Ellen stood next. Show them where the gate was. The room changed. You could feel it. Chairs creaked. Someone whispered, "What gate?" Thomas connected his laptop to the projector before Vanessa could stop him. The county survey appeared on the wall. Parcel 14B glowed yellow. My property. Then came photographs of the gate positioned hundreds of feet inside my boundary. Next, the disposal site. Blue drums. Containers. Disturbed soil. The skid steer. The trail camera. Vanessa slapped one palm against the table. Those images are part of an active investigation and are being presented without context. Here's context, I said. It was the first time I'd spoken. I carried Uncle Ray's original denial letter to the front and placed it beneath the document camera. His red circle around the missing easement filled the screen. Then I showed the contractor's apology. 27 unauthorized truck entries. Finally, the access agreement Vanessa had delivered to my mailbox. She says my uncle signed this. Vanessa leaned forward. He did. I let the silence sit for 2 seconds. My uncle suffered a stroke before that date. Nobody moved. His right hand was partially paralyzed. I placed a hospital form beside the alleged agreement. Ray's real signature shook downward in broken strokes. The HOA version was smooth enough for a bank advertisement. A woman in the second row whispered, "Oh my God." Vanessa's face hardened. "You are not a handwriting expert." "No," I said. "But the state investigator who requested both originals is going to use one." That landed. Her knuckles turned white against the table. Then Thomas opened his financial folder. GreenLine Environmental Management. Monthly payments. Vanessa's initials. No physical office. No competitive bids. More homeowners started talking at once. One asked why landscaping disposal had cost nearly $140,000 in 18 months. Another wanted invoices. Another demanded the contract. Vanessa reached for the gavel. Thomas reached the microphone first. "There's one more thing." He displayed a payment authorization from 3 weeks earlier. GreenLine had received another $12,400 after environmental officers secured the dumping site. The payment description read emergency remediation. I stared at Vanessa. So did everyone else. The room became completely silent. She hadn't merely known about the site. Someone had been paid after we discovered it. And judging by the panic spreading across her face, Thomas had just uncovered the first transaction she never expected anyone to see. The room stayed silent until Vanessa reached for the power cord. Thomas caught her wrist before she could pull it from the projector. Not hard, just enough to stop her. Leave it running. Vanessa stared at him, then at 60 homeowners watching from folding chairs. The confidence I'd seen at my gate was gone. That payment was authorized remediation, she said. Exactly what the description says. Thomas clicked once. Another invoice appeared. Same amount. Same date. Different description. Emergency debris relocation. 2 versions, he said. Which one did we pay for? Vanessa's perfume seemed almost sharp enough to taste from where I stood. She looked toward the clubhouse doors. Nobody blocked them. Nobody needed to. Leaving now would say more than staying. This meeting is adjourned. She struck the gavel. Nobody moved. The next morning, I met Harris and Rachel at my property. The laboratory results had arrived. Rachel didn't dramatize them. She didn't have to. Several soil samples showed petroleum contamination above normal background levels, and one area required additional testing. She was careful with every word. Investigation ongoing. Source not yet conclusively established. No assumptions. I appreciated that. Facts were finally doing what anger couldn't. Harris had something else. Investigators had traced GreenLine's mailing information through business filings. The company wasn't registered to Vanessa. It belonged to a man named Curtis Whitmore. Her husband? I asked. Harris shook his head. Brother. I actually laughed once. Short. No humor in it. GreenLine had billed Cedar Ridge for hauling material away. Material that appeared to have been hauled behind a gate on my land instead. If investigators confirmed those records matched the site, Vanessa hadn't merely hidden a dumping operation. Cedar Ridge homeowners may have been paying someone connected to her family to create it. But I still needed the piece Uncle Ray had left behind. I found it that afternoon. Not in his filing cabinet. In his workshop. I was moving an old steel toolbox when I noticed a black electrical cord disappearing behind the pegboard. Ray had never mounted anything there that needed power. I removed 4 screws. Behind the panel sat a dusty digital recorder connected to a small exterior camera system. Old technology. Nothing fancy. But Ray had aimed one camera down the back road years before I inherited the property. The recorder still contained archived clips. I spent hours scrolling through grainy footage. Deer. Rain. Ray's Ford. Delivery trucks. Then I saw the black gate being installed. Date stamped September 14th. Vanessa stood beside the crew. Uncle Ray confronted her. No audio from that camera, but the images were clear. He pointed toward the survey marker. She pointed toward the road. He handed her a document. She refused it. Then came something better. Ray walked directly toward the workshop camera afterward and held the document in front of the lens. Permission denied. The same letter sitting in my binder. He had created his own timestamp. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the screen. You stubborn old man. But Ray wasn't finished. 3 weeks later, footage showed GreenLine trucks passing the camera after midnight. 1, 2, 4, 7. Different dates. Same direction. Loaded going in. Empty coming out. My phone vibrated. Thomas. Daniel, we found the original board minutes. What do they say? His breathing sounded uneven. Vanessa told the board your uncle granted access verbally. I looked at Ray frozen on my monitor, holding his written denial toward the camera. He didn't. I know. Thomas paused. There's more. Ellen found an email from Vanessa telling the property manager not to contact Ray directly because he was becoming confused about the arrangement. My hand tightened around the phone. Uncle Ray hadn't been confused. He'd documented everything because nobody listened. I copied the footage twice, placed one drive in my safe, and handed the other directly to Harris that evening. He watched the gate installation without speaking, then the nighttime trucks, then Ray holding up his denial letter. When the screen went dark, Harris exhaled slowly. This changes things. Outside, rain started ticking against the workshop roof. I could smell wet earth through the open door. The same earth someone had assumed an old man wouldn't be able to protect. Vanessa thought Ray's age made him easy to ignore. What she hadn't understood was that he'd spent his final years planting evidence. And now every piece was starting to bloom. The first subpoena arrived at Cedar Ridge headquarters at 9:12 on Monday morning. I know because Thomas called me 4 minutes later. His voice had that strange mixture of relief and terror people get when something they've feared finally becomes official. They want everything, he said. Contracts, emails, bank statements, vendor records. 5 years. I stood in Uncle Ray's workshop staring at the old recorder while rainwater dripped from the barn roof outside. Then give them everything. By noon, County investigators were carrying archive boxes from the clubhouse. Vanessa arrived in her white Lexus wearing sunglasses despite the gray sky. She marched toward Harris with her attorney beside her, but nobody argued with her. Nobody needed to. Paperwork had already taken control. The next move came from environmental enforcement. Rachel's team brought a small excavator onto my back 12 acres. The diesel engine rattled through the pines while the bucket peeled back soil from the first disturbed mound. I stood behind the safety line with Harris. Vanessa remained near the road, arms folded tightly across her cream jacket. The bucket rose. Broken asphalt, roofing debris, pink containers, construction material. Then another layer. More waste. Rachel photographed each exposure before allowing the operator to continue. "This wasn't one load," she said quietly. I already knew that from Ray's footage, but seeing the layers stacked beneath my land made it different. Somebody had turned my uncle's woods into a ledger written in dirt. Every truck had left a line. Every buried load had left a date waiting to be reconstructed. Harris received a call and walked away. When he returned, his expression had changed. GreenLine's bank records came back. Vanessa couldn't hear us from where she stood, and payments from Cedar Ridge went into the company account. Within days, portions were transferred elsewhere. Where? Harris looked toward Vanessa. An account jointly held by Curtis Whitmore and his sister. I didn't need him to say her name. The wind moved through the pines with a low hiss. Vanessa saw us looking at her and immediately turned toward her attorney. There it was. The payoff to every invoice Thomas had questioned. The fake vendor. The midnight trucks. The gate. The cameras. They weren't separate problems. They were one machine. Cedar Ridge homeowners paid GreenLine to dispose of community construction waste legally. GreenLine apparently saved the real disposal costs by bringing material onto my land instead. The gate kept residents from seeing the trucks. The cameras warned Vanessa when someone approached. And Ray's supposed access agreement gave her a piece of paper to waive if anybody asked why. Except Ray had refused. In writing. On camera. That afternoon, Thomas called an emergency board vote. Vanessa was suspended from all HOA authority pending investigation. Her electronic access to association accounts was terminated. Cedar Ridge's attorney instructed board members to preserve every record and communicate only through official channels. The suburban kingdom she'd controlled through fines, threats, and polished letterhead vanished before dinner. But Vanessa still had one move left. At 6:40 that evening, my trail camera sent an alert. A white Lexus had stopped near the fallen gate. I opened the live feed. Vanessa stepped out carrying a cardboard file box. My pulse kicked once. She looked toward the trees, then toward the secured disposal site. She wasn't supposed to be there. I called Harris instead of confronting her. "She's back." He was already nearby. His cruiser arrived before Vanessa made it 50 yards. Blue lights flashed against wet pine trunks. She froze with the box in her hands. Harris stepped out. Ms. Whitmore put the box on the ground. Her attorney wasn't there now. Neither was her board. Just Vanessa, the gate she'd illegally installed, and the road she'd spent years trying to hide. She lowered the box. One folder slipped from the top and landed open in the mud. Even from behind Harris, I recognized the heading. GreenLine Environmental Management, Disposal Logs. Vanessa closed her eyes. Harris looked down at the papers, then back at her. "Were you planning to remove these from the site?" "I was protecting confidential HOA records." "From investigators?" She didn't answer. Harris photographed the box exactly where it sat and requested another unit. I stayed behind the property line marker, listening to the soft crackle of his radio. For months, Vanessa had treated that steel gate like a symbol of her authority. Now it lay rusting in the weeds 20 yards away while she stood beside the evidence she'd tried to carry through it. I finally understood Uncle Ray's lesson completely. You don't beat people like Vanessa by becoming louder than they are. You mark the boundary. You save the letter. You keep the camera running. Then you wait for them to cross the line one final time. The cardboard box Vanessa carried back onto my land turned out to be heavier than it looked. Not because of the paper, because of what the paper connected. By sunrise, investigators had cataloged every folder exactly where Harris found it. Disposal logs, GreenLine invoices, truck numbers, payment authorizations, even handwritten load sheets matching dates from Uncle Ray's camera footage. Vanessa had apparently spent years building the evidence against herself, then tried carrying half of it away in one box. The county moved fast after that. Cedar Ridge's clubhouse office was sealed pending collection of association records. Computers were imaged. Financial accounts connected to GreenLine were flagged for review. Environmental investigators expanded testing across the back 12 acres, while contractors mapped every disturbed section of soil. I stood near the old gate watching orange evidence markers appear between the trees. Each little flag felt like another sentence in Ray's story finally being read. Thomas and Ellen arrived before noon. Neither said much. Thomas handed me a copy of the board's unanimous resolution permanently removing Vanessa as president. Nobody voted for her, he said. Not even the people who defended her last week. I folded the paper once. What happens to Cedar Ridge? We rebuild it. That answer mattered more than I expected. I never wanted 60 families punished because one woman had mistaken community leadership for private power. They had paid dues expecting roads, landscaping, and maintenance. Instead, part of their money had apparently traveled through GreenLine, while waste traveled the opposite direction onto my land. The new board authorized an independent audit before sunset. Then came the moment I had been waiting for since the grinder touched that first hinge. Harris asked me to meet him at the disposal site. Vanessa was there with her attorney. No cream jacket this time. No pearl earrings. Just dark slacks, a gray sweater, and a face that looked 10 years older. Rachel stood beside the excavated mound, holding a clipboard. Harris opened one of the recovered folders. Ms. Whitmore, these logs identify parcel 14B as the GreenLine disposal location. Vanessa's attorney started speaking. Harris raised one hand. I'm documenting what we found. He turned a page. These entries correspond with vehicle dates recorded by Mr. Mercer's surveillance system. Another page. And these payment approvals carry your initials. Vanessa looked at me. Your uncle knew. The words came out almost like an accusation. I stepped closer, stopping behind the evidence tape. Then why did he write permission denied? Silence. Why did you tell your board he agreed verbally? Her jaw tightened. Ray was difficult. That sentence hit harder than anything she'd said before. Difficult. An old man defending his land was difficult. A property line was difficult. Written consent was difficult. Everything became difficult when it stood between Vanessa and what she wanted. I reached into my binder and removed Ray's photograph from September 14th. Him beside the freshly installed gate. Newspaper in one hand. Denial letter in the other. He wasn't difficult, I said. He was documenting you. Vanessa looked away. By late afternoon, investigators escorted her from the site while her attorney followed. Harris wouldn't speculate about charges, and I didn't ask him to. This wasn't television. Real investigations take time. Evidence gets tested. Records get verified. People get due process. That was fine. Patience had gotten me this far. The county ordered GreenLine and responsible parties identified through the investigation to preserve records connected to cleanup costs. Cedar Ridge's new board suspended every questionable vendor contract. The gate itself remained where it had fallen, black steel streaked with rust beside the road. I could have hauled it away that afternoon. Instead, I left it there, not as revenge, as evidence. 3 weeks later, I walked the road with Thomas while cleanup crews prepared the first contaminated section for removal. Chains rattled. Diesel engines idled. Fresh pine mixed with the bitter smell of exposed soil. Thomas stopped beside the fallen gate. Hard to believe all this started because you removed that. I shook my head. No, this started when they put it here. That's the difference people like Vanessa never understand. Removing the gate didn't create the truth. It only removed what was hiding it. And once Deputy Harris looked beyond those hinges, the HOA's little wall of paperwork, intimidation, and silence finally came down with it. 6 months later, the only thing standing where Vanessa's gate had been was one of Uncle Ray's old survey posts. I cleaned the rust from its cap myself. No black steel. No HOA warning signs. No camera watching the road. Just a weathered piece of iron marking a boundary that had been there long before Cedar Ridge decided boundaries were negotiable. Cleanup took 4 months. Trucks rolled through almost every weekday, but this time I knew exactly what they carried. Contaminated soil went out. Clean fill came in. Every load was documented. Every invoice was audited. I sometimes stood beside the barn drinking coffee while diesel engines growled through the trees, thinking about those midnight trucks Ray had recorded years earlier. Same road. Opposite purpose. Cedar Ridge survived. That mattered to me. Thomas won the next board election after promising something painfully simple. No secret contracts, no unrecorded agreements, no spending without review. Ellen helped publish monthly financial reports online. Homeowners could finally see where their money went. The independent audit uncovered enough questionable transactions that the association's attorney referred additional records to investigators. GreenLine disappeared from Cedar Ridge's vendor list permanently. Vanessa disappeared from the clubhouse too. Her white Lexus stopped patrolling the neighborhood. Her name vanished from HOA letterhead. The last update Harris gave me was careful, professional, and exactly what I expected from him. The investigation had moved beyond a property dispute. Financial records, environmental violations, the disputed access document, and the attempted removal of records were being handled through the proper legal process. He wouldn't predict the outcome. Neither would I. Justice isn't justice if you decide the verdict before the evidence gets its turn. What I did know was simpler. Vanessa no longer controlled my road. She no longer controlled Cedar Ridge. And nobody could pretend Uncle Ray had willingly handed over his land. The forged agreement was challenged. His written denials were preserved. His camera footage established what he'd been saying when people dismissed him as a stubborn old man. That part meant more to me than any settlement ever could. One Saturday morning, I carried the fallen gate out with my excavator. The chains clanked against the bucket while 12 feet of black steel swung above the gravel. I could still see Cedar Ridge HOA stamped across the center. 6 months earlier, those letters had looked like authority. Now they looked like scrap metal. Thomas happened to be there. Keeping it, he asked. One piece. I cut a section from the hinge with the same angle grinder I'd used that first morning. Sparks sprayed across the gravel again. Same orange light. Same smell of burning steel. Different feeling. I mounted that hinge inside Uncle Ray's workshop beneath his framed denial letter. Not because I wanted a trophy. Because I wanted to remember the sequence. A boundary ignored. A letter dismissed. A gate installed. Trucks hidden. Records manipulated. Then one ordinary Saturday, when somebody finally removed the obstruction and looked behind it. Later that evening, I walked down the restored road toward the creek. Fresh gravel crunched beneath my boots. The pines were turning black against an orange Tennessee sunset, and clean water moved over the rocks with that steady sound Ray loved. I stopped where the gate had stood. For years, Vanessa had used 12 feet of steel to create an illusion. This side belonged to her. That side wasn't my concern. Don't ask questions. Don't cross the line. But property lines work both ways. So does evidence. I rested my hand on Ray's survey post and finally understood why he'd saved every letter and aimed that old camera down an empty gravel road. He wasn't waiting for revenge. He was waiting for the truth to have a witness. Vanessa thought patience meant weakness. She thought an old man's silence meant permission. She thought expensive letterhead could turn trespassing into authority. She was wrong about all three. I didn't defeat Cedar Ridge. I didn't need to. I removed one gate from my own land, and Deputy Harris simply looked at what was behind it. Everything after that came from records, witnesses, and the choices Vanessa had already made. That's the thing about justice. You don't always have to chase it. Sometimes you mark your boundary, preserve the evidence, and wait. Justice isn't loud. It's smart, patient, and inevitable.